The house sat in Bedford, New York, quiet, hidden among tall maples and centuries-old oaks. A winding driveway led up to it, secluded from the road and barely visible to passersby. Christopher Reeve had lived there during the later years of his life, after the accident that changed everything. After his passing in 2004, the estate was managed by a trust for years. Empty, but maintained, like a shrine no one dared disturb. Until 2023, the new owners weren't celebrities. They weren't even locals. Tom and Heather Langley were both in their early 40s, originally from Ohio. Tom worked remotely for a tech company. Heather was an interior designer with a fondness for East Coast colonial style. They weren't particularly interested in the house's history. It was Heather's idea. She'd seen a listing online late one night, glass of wine in hand, and showed it to Tom with a casual, "Isn't this beautiful?" They had the money, and the house, massive but weathered, isolated but charming, was undervalued. Far below what it should have been, considering the location and the name attached to it. They moved in during early spring. April was cool that year, and the trees were just starting to bud. The house was fully furnished, right down to books still on the shelves. Reeve's books. His desk remained. His piano untouched. Covered with a sheet sat near a dusty window in the living room. The realtor had explained this, casually brushing it off. His family didn't want to move everything. It was easier to leave it. Most buyers actually like it adds character. Heather didn't mind. She loved vintage pieces. Tom, practical and skeptical, found it odd. But he let it go. The first 2 weeks were uneventful. Quiet, peaceful even. Heather spent her mornings walking the property with their golden retriever, Louie, and her afternoons planning small renovations. She especially wanted to open up the library, make it brighter. "Too many shadows," she told Tom. "Like the walls are closing in." The first sign came one night after midnight. Tom was in the kitchen, getting a glass of water. He swore he saw someone move through the hallway beyond the kitchen door, just a figure, tall, dark, gone in an instant. He called out, thinking Heather was up, but she was still in bed, asleep. He told himself it was a reflection, a trick of light. A few days later, Heather heard the piano, just a single note, in the middle of the day. She was in the garden, pruning a rose bush, and Louie, usually calm, stiffened beside her, ears high. She thought it might have been the wind, maybe a squirrel running across the keys. But when she came in, the sheet covering the piano had been pulled back. Still, she said nothing. At night, the house creaked. It was old. That was normal. But this was different, soft tapping behind the walls, like footsteps above them when no one was upstairs. Doors left open that Tom remembered closing. The scent of old cologne, something earthy and clean, not from any product they owned, wafting through the hallway by the study. Heather finally broke the silence during dinner one night. "Do you ever feel like we're not alone here?" Tom didn't answer immediately, but when he finally looked up, he just said, "Yeah, I do." They both laughed nervously, like it was a joke. But it wasn't. By late April, the mornings in Bedford had warmed slightly, though the house always felt 10 degrees colder than the air outside. Tom began to avoid the library without realizing it. The room had an oppressive quality to it, dim even with all the lamps on, and never quite warm no matter how high he turned the thermostat. It had once been Christopher Reeve's favorite room, according to a neighbor they met walking their dog. A man in his 70s named Bert, who remembered Reeve wheeling along the gravel driveway with a caretaker at his side. He loved that room, Bert had said. Spent whole days in there, especially after the accident. Read books, wrote letters, practiced speech therapy. That knowledge should have been comforting, even touching. But instead, it made the room feel watched. Heather insisted on leaving it as it was for the time being. "It's beautiful," she said. "It just needs light." But the tall, narrow windows faced north, blocked by dense pine, and even on cloudless days, the room never looked alive. One afternoon, while Tom was on a Zoom call and Louie slept at her feet, Heather brought in a tall mirror from the master bedroom and propped it against the far wall of the library, hoping it would bounce some light around. The mirror was old and gold-framed, heavy, ornate. She positioned it carefully, stepped back to examine the effect and froze. In the reflection, she saw the library exactly as it was. Dusty books, heavy furniture, her own figure standing barefoot on the faded rug. And then movement, not behind her, behind the reflection. A man in a wheelchair. He was just there just for a moment, facing away from her, near the window. A shadowed figure with broad shoulders, the curve of the chair unmistakable, the silhouette static and silent. She turned sharply, heart pounding, but the room was empty. She looked back at the mirror. Nothing now but herself. Her face pale, her breathing shallow. She didn't scream. She didn't call for Tom. She stood in silence, watching the space by the window for a long time before picking up the mirror and carrying it back to the bedroom. She leaned it against the wall, covered it with a blanket, and didn't mention it to anyone, not even that night, when Tom noticed her quietness and asked if something was wrong. "It's just a weird day," she said. That night, Heather dreamed she was sitting at the piano, hands resting on the keys. The room was silent, and in the dream, she could not move, not even to turn her head. She heard someone breathing behind her, slow and deliberate, and when a hand touched her shoulder, she woke with a gasp. Tom stirred beside her, but didn't wake. She didn't sleep again. The following week, Tom took a business trip to Boston. Just 2 nights. Heather didn't want to be alone, but she didn't want to tell him why. She made vague excuses about unfinished unpacking and interior planning. Said she was excited for a little time to focus. That first night, the house seemed to change. It was subtle at first. The sound of the floorboards creaking in the hallway, nothing unusual. Except it didn't stop. It would creak, then pause, then creak again. Louis, usually sprawled on the bedroom rug by 9 p.m., refused to come upstairs. He sat at the base of the staircase, looking up, growling low in his throat. When Heather called him, he backed away and walked into the kitchen instead. The air grew heavy, like the atmosphere in the library had begun to spread. At 11:17 p.m., she heard the front door open. She knew it wasn't open before. She'd locked it. She'd checked it. She heard the groan of the old hinges, slow and deliberate, and then nothing. No footsteps, no wind, just stillness. Heather got up and stood at the top of the stairs, her hand on the railing, her breath caught in her chest. The darkness downstairs was absolute. No moonlight filtered through the thick trees. No glow from the street. Not that the house was near any. It felt like she was staring into the mouth of something ancient and hollow. She waited, heart pounding in her ears. Then the piano. One key. A low note. Heavy and deliberate. She didn't move. Couldn't. Another note. Slightly higher. Almost hesitant. And then silence. She slept with the bedroom light on and the door locked, her body tense under the blanket, every muscle alert. In the morning, the front door was still shut, but the sheet had been pulled from the piano again, and the keys showed the faint smudge of fingerprints in the dust. Not her hands, not Tom's. Larger, spaced differently, as if the fingers had been splayed awkwardly. She finally told Tom everything when he came back. The figure in the mirror, the footsteps, the dream, the piano. And for the first time, Tom didn't argue. He didn't rationalize. He sat in silence, staring at the dark grain of the kitchen table. Then he said, "I saw him too, a week ago, in the library." Heather blinked. "What?" Tom didn't look up. "I was working in there, late, just finishing something up. I looked up, and I swear to God, there was someone across the room, sitting by the window, just watching me." He rubbed his eyes. "I thought I imagined it. I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to scare you." They stared at each other for a long time. No one said the name, but they were both thinking it. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. By the time May settled over Bedford, the house had grown quieter, not more peaceful, but quieter in the way a church feels silent long after the service ends. The air felt thicker, like the house was holding its breath. Even the birds that once sang outside the tall living room windows seemed to avoid the property. The pine trees stood darker now. The gravel of the driveway no longer crunched beneath their tires in a familiar way. It sounded sharper, more hollow, as if something had shifted beneath the soil. Tom and Heather started talking in whispers, though neither realized it at first. They moved through rooms like they were guests in someone else's home, afraid to disturb what no longer felt like theirs. Their meals grew shorter. Heather's appetite dwindled. Tom began working in the kitchen instead of the library, despite having converted that room into a perfect home office weeks earlier. The study door stayed shut now, always, but the house wouldn't let them ignore it. Late one evening, Tom was organizing digital files on his laptop, client documents, internal reports, invoices, and stumbled on a strange folder buried on his desktop. It was labeled _transcripts. He didn't remember creating it. Inside were 6 Word files, each named with dates: 2003-10-01, 2003-10-15, and so on. He clicked on the first. They were transcripts, recorded by someone named Marian Gold. Therapy sessions. The speaker was referred to only as CR. I used to dream in movement. The first entry began. Even after the injury, I'd run, fly, fall, and wake up in that bed. Every time, unable to turn my head. The worst part isn't the pain. It's the stillness. Tom leaned back, blinking. The writing didn't seem fictional. It wasn't polished or poetic. It was raw, fragmented, real. There are days when I want to disappear, the transcript continued. Not die, just stop being seen. The timestamp showed it had been edited 12 years ago, long before Tom bought the laptop. He printed all 6 entries and didn't tell Heather. But he read them, again and again, long into the night, feeling something tighten in his chest. Not fear, not quite, more like guilt, like he was reading something that was never meant to be found. Meanwhile, Heather had begun to sense something else. Presence, yes, but also a pattern. Every day, around 4:30 in the afternoon, a cold draft moved through the upstairs hallway. No matter the weather, the windows were closed. The HVAC system had been inspected and serviced just 2 months prior, but the draft came anyway, whispering through the corridor like breath. The house groaned gently, as if reacting to it. She started standing there, alone, just to feel it pass. It didn't scare her anymore, fascinated her, felt sorrowful, not malevolent. One afternoon, standing in that familiar chill, she heard a voice behind her. It was hoarse, soft, low. "Can you help me?" She turned. No one was there. The next day, Heather went into the library for the first time in over a week. The curtains were drawn, and the room glowed dim amber from a floor lamp near the far corner. Dust floated thick in the light. The air was warm but still. She sat in the old leather chair beneath the bookshelf, staring at the window where she'd once seen the reflection in the mirror. She stayed there a long time, not expecting anything, not hoping, just sitting. Eventually, she noticed a piece of paper tucked between the pages of a large hardcover book, A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. She pulled it free. It was a handwritten letter, faded, in neat cursive. The ink had bled slightly on one edge, as if a drop of water had fallen there long ago. "To anyone who lives here after me, I hope you find peace in these walls. I tried. I truly tried. But this house remembers. It doesn't hold pain. It echoes it. Don't mistake silence for stillness. They are not the same. And if you hear me, if you see me, please know, I'm not lost. Just waiting." There was no signature. Heather folded the letter carefully and placed it on the desk. That night, she told Tom everything. The voice, the draft, the letter, and he finally showed her the transcripts. They read them aloud, by the kitchen light, the pages trembling slightly in Tom's hands. The words weren't frightening. They were lonely, full of longing, frustration, a desperate desire to communicate. As if the presence in the house didn't want to scare them, it wanted to be heard. The next morning, they opened the study. Together, the door creaked on its hinges, resisting like something ancient had settled into the wood. The room beyond was dark, though the window faced east and should have been flooded with sunlight. The curtains were closed, but the light that leaked through was pale and heavy, like smoke. Everything was undisturbed. the desk, the old lamp, a photograph of a young boy, barely visible beneath a layer of dust. A notepad with words scribbled across it in a shaky hand. Heather stepped forward first, crossing the room in silence. She reached for the lamp, then paused. The air had changed again, heavier now, not just sadness, something like anticipation, like the house was holding its breath once more. She clicked the lamp on. The bulb flickered, then held. And in the reflection of the dark window, behind their own shapes, another figure stood. Silent. Watching. Just watching. After seeing the figure in the window's reflection, they both stood frozen. Tom's hand rested lightly on the back of Heather's shoulder, and neither dared to speak. The figure wasn't detailed, just a shape. Shoulders that seemed too broad for someone seated, but the outline unmistakable. The curve of a wheelchair, the straightness of a man who had lived with stillness so long it had reshaped his body. And even in the lack of light, there was an undeniable sense of focus in the reflection, as though the figure wasn't just watching them, it was waiting. Then it was gone. Not vanishing with a flicker, not fading slowly. One moment it was part of the reflection, and the next there was only the window. Only their two shapes, the desk, the stillness of morning. Heather turned to look behind her slowly, her chest tightening, and of course, there was nothing there. But the feeling didn't lift. If anything, it thickened. The sense of presence wasn't just in that one room now. It had bled into the walls, the floor, the very smell of the place, linen and old paper and something else. Something dry and earthy, like wilted roses sealed in a box. They didn't speak of it again that day. Instead, they went through the house like caretakers, not owners. They checked closets, opened drawers, went into the attic. There was no attic fan, but the air up there was strangely warm and filled with boxes none of the movers had brought. Personal effects left behind. Maybe deliberately, they found journals, sketches, a short stack of VHS tapes labeled only by year. 1997, 1999, 2002. Later that night, after pouring 2 glasses of wine they wouldn't drink, they watched the first tape. It was mostly silent. The view from a fixed camera, probably placed on a tripod. The same study they now sat in. The same desk. In the frame, Christopher Reeve, thinner than Tom remembered from interviews or films, sat in profile, speaking slowly. A speech therapist, off-screen, responded gently, coaxing out syllables. They watched in silence as Reeve tried to repeat words: home, light, outside. Remember. There was no drama in it. No horror. Just effort. Intensity. Fragility. And it made what they were experiencing feel worse somehow. Not because it frightened them, but because it made it real. They were not being haunted by a ghost in the traditional sense. There were no slamming doors, no floating objects, no guttural voices in the walls. They were sharing space with someone's last, quiet ache. And that ache had not stopped resonating. Tom woke before dawn 3 nights later to find the house unbearably quiet. Not the gentle quiet of early morning, but the wrong kind. The kind that pressed against his ears and made him feel like he'd gone underwater. Heather wasn't in bed. He got up, heart racing, and padded through the house, down the stairs, across the dark hall. She was in the library, sitting at the piano, just sitting, her back straight, her bare feet on the rug, her hands resting on her knees. She didn't look at him when he entered. "I felt like I needed to listen," she said softly. "To what?" But she didn't answer. Tom sat down on the small couch near the bookshelf and waited. The room seemed less hostile than it had a month ago. Not warm, but not cold. The air had settled. The light that crept in through the window now felt like morning, even if the sun hadn't quite breached the trees. Heather lifted her hand, hesitated, then touched a single key on the piano. A low minor note, then another, and another. Not a song, not a melody, just notes. Each one felt familiar. Tom realized after a few moments that she was repeating the sequence from the night she'd heard the piano playing itself. She was matching it, recalling it perfectly. The same 3 notes, then silence. Heather closed the cover over the keys and said nothing more. They both sat for a long while listening, waiting, but nothing came. That afternoon, they returned to the study one final time. Heather brought the transcripts. Tom brought the letter they'd found inside the book. They placed both on the desk, laid flat, beside a photograph of the house from years ago, snow blanketing the roof. A single wreath on the door. They didn't speak, just placed the objects like offerings. Tom said quietly, "We hear you," and Heather followed, "You're not alone." Then they left the room and closed the door behind them. That night they both slept deeply. The first uninterrupted sleep either of them had known in weeks. In the weeks that followed, the house began to change. Not dramatically, but subtly. The draft in the hallway no longer came at the same time. Sometimes not at all. The mirror stayed covered. The piano remained untouched. Louis began to sleep upstairs again. And though they still avoided the library after dark, it no longer felt threatening. It was just a room, a quiet room, with quiet memories. They didn't forget what happened. They didn't explain it away, but they stopped trying to define it. Some echoes, they realized, are not warnings or threats. They are just remnants. The final sound of someone who didn't want to leave completely, who had more to say, more to feel, more to share. Not out of fear, but out of love, out of grief, out of the need to still exist if only in the breath between silence and sound. And so they let the house hold him, not as a ghost, but as memory, alive in the corners, the pages, the warmth of the late afternoon sun on the floorboards. And sometimes, when the wind moved just right through the pine outside the window, they could swear they heard a voice soft, but certain saying, "Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story."